So I'm going to start us and very much welcome Dr. Henry Rothstein from the King's Centre for Risk Management at King's College. Welcome, Henry, and we'll let you get going.
Well, thank you. It's great to have a monologue here. There's no danger of being contradicted at all. Well, actually, it's a bit of a change of gear because I'm not an expert in healthcare systems or regulation. I was actually asked to speak more generally about risk regulation, which is my interest more generally. And actually, I want to talk a bit about some preliminary findings from a pan-European project I'm currently conducting with colleagues in France, Germany, and the Netherlands, on what has become known as risk-based regulation, which I think is a term that many of you in this room are familiar with. One of my collaborators, and obviously is sitting over there. And in particular, what we're looking at is how risk ideas and tools are conceived in different national regulatory contexts. And to start with, I'd like to start with some puzzles. First, I think probably everyone is very familiar with. 2012, 6 Italian seismologists were found guilty of manslaughter for failing to warn the population of the Italian city of L'Aquila of a disastrous earthquake. Some of you may be less familiar with the case a few months later, when a French psychiatrist was found guilty of manslaughter because her patient murdered an elderly man. And a similar thing actually happened in Germany with a German psychiatrist around the same time. In each case, supporters of the convicted expressed outrage with the legal system's treatment of professionals faced with risk and uncertainty. And here's the second puzzle. I have to say, if I'd realised what the hum is in the audience, I'd have thought twice perhaps about using it. But in 2007, the UK won a protracted court battle with the European Commission, the European Court of Justice, which was in no small measure due to Robert's work, which confirmed the UK's right to define the goal of occupational health and safety regulation as an explicit trade-off between risk and cost. Now, the European Commission had complained the UK's risk-based goal of health and safety regulation, that workers should only be protected against harm so far as is reasonably practicable, comprised worker protection by undermining the goal of the 1989 Framework Directive to ensure the safety and health of workers in every aspect related to the work. Other member states, such as Germany and France, had implemented the directive without the qualification, and so the Commission argued so should the UK. But the UK argued that the only safe worker was probably an unemployed one, and that it's impossible to eliminate all workplace risks. What was important was not to ensure safety, but rather to ensure the cost, time and effort to reduce worker exposure to risk was not grossly disproportionate to the benefit gained. So, these cases are a reminder of the varied ways in which different regulatory cultures can respond to adverse events. And the kind of cases I think that are the grist to the mill for a long-standing governance movement, whose mission is to make regulation more rational by making it risk-based. And the movement, I think, insists that absolute safety is neither possible nor desirable. Rather, it's more efficient and rational. Regulations take account of probability as well as impact of potential adverse outcomes, be it in setting goals of regulation or in seeking to enforce compliance with those goals, which many of you here do. By so doing, efforts can be focused on governing those risks deemed unacceptable rather than trying to prevent all possible harms. Now, the use of probability impact frameworks for structuring regulation has colonised decision-making internationally across many policy domains, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries such as the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. So take, for example, the Department for Environment's euphemistic phrase, making space for water, which captures a conceptual shift from flood defence to flood risk management, which government explicitly sought to define the limits of its flood management responsibility. That is unless you happen to live in a Tory constituency somewhere in the southwest. Or consider how probation officers notably defend their actions in terms of managing risk rather than securing public safety when violent criminals have committed offences on release from prison. This is an example of the kind of probation risk management framework. And indeed, the Regulators Compliance Code, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, demands all enforcement agencies with food safety and healthcare to higher education and housing should adopt a risk-based approach to regulation. But ideas of risk-based regulation are predicated on certain expectations of what the state is for. There's often arguments in the UK, as we've seen with flooding and other cases, horsemeat, less known in other European countries. And I think the reason is that at its root, risk is a different differentiating principle of intervention that explicitly sets out who is targeted and protected and who is not targeted and protected, according to the efficiency of securing regulatory outcomes. But this utilitarian philosophy of optimising regulatory interventions can conflict with a range of sometimes hardwired institutional constraints in different country contexts, of which I'm going to discuss just 3 examples. So the first constraint is constitutional. The UK has an unwritten constitution which emphasises parliamentary sovereignty to legislators it sees fit. If Parliament chooses to sanction regulatory actions that are determined by optimising outcomes, then so be it. Whether it be protecting some parts of the country from flooding at the expense of others, or introducing risk-based anti-terrorism measures that profile particular groups in society. Other countries, however, I think have more rights-based approaches that can be constitutionally protected. So, for example, in France, the constitutional principle of equal rights conflicts with the explicit priority setting inherent to risk-based regulatory frameworks. So, for example, during the 2009 H1N1 flu pandemic, the French Minister of Health had to decide whether to provide vaccines for the 30% of the population that was necessary to establish herd immunity, or to provide for everyone. Well, in the event, she decided to provide it for everyone, because she had no legal grounds that decides which third should get the preferential treatment. I think in the end, probably hardly anybody took up the vaccine, but the principle's there. Likewise, targeting anti-terrorism activities on groups in society deemed to be the most vulnerable to extremist ideas is very difficult to operationalise in a state that formally refuses to differentiate between its citizens. Everybody's French. And this is a real issue, I think, that the French National Security Agencies are having at the moment. In Germany, the Constitution also establishes more rights-based protections. So one example, and I'd say one which is rather close to my heart, is that of higher education. Well, paragraph 3 of Article 5 of the German Constitution, which is about freedom for expression, explicitly protects the freedom of German academics to research and teach. And any state interference in those matters would be unconstitutional. Well, compare that with the steady erosion of academic freedoms in the UK through increasing controls from HEFCE, QAA, REF and Impact. Indeed, HEFCE has even coined the category of academic risk. Constructs academics like myself as kind of analogous to toxic chemicals that pose risks to students and their institutions. A second set of constraints, I think, concern legal tradition. And in particular, the way in which risk-based regulation has a better fit with common law systems than civil law systems. And I think this sometimes underlies some of the kind of conflicts that arise perhaps at the EU level. Well, risk-based regulation, I think at least how we operationalise it in the UK, and I think there might be some differences around Anglo-Saxon countries, is a paradigmatic example of what you'll be familiar with as principles-based regulation, which focuses on setting out broad principles of conduct for regulatees to interpret as befits the particular situation, such as drive carefully in bad weather. Such approaches contrast with more rule-based approaches that set out detailed rules for all circumstances, such as setting speed limits, irrespective of perhaps a road type, or according to different types of road. The value of principles-based approaches is their flexibility to deal with the wide variety of circumstances that regulators, such as here, inevitably find hard to anticipate. But the problem is that they require commonly held interpretive principles to ensure their consistent application. By contrast, rule-based approaches offer legal precision, but only at the expense of having to elaborate rules for every single situation that are likely to be encountered. Now, the most notable example of principles-based regulation is perhaps the UK Occupational Health and Safety Regulation. In its requirements, as noted earlier, the worker should be protected against harm so far as is reasonably practicable. This approach was established in the 1970s against the backdrop of failure of rules-based approaches. Was possible because the British common law tradition places great weight on consistent legal interpretation by the courts through precedential case law. In health and safety, that consistency was achieved by the higher courts establishing effectively a kind of, not to get into detail, cost-benefit test back in the 1940s, and by the activities of an expert inspectorate that is competent to assess compliance with that cost-benefit test. And that expert inspection is crucial because otherwise regulators aren't going to be really sure whether they're going to be meeting the principle. Of course, the problem is that flexibility can sometimes lead to inconsistency. My guess is that's part of the origin of the kind of the health and safety madness trope that's beloved of the pages of the Daily Mail. But by contrast, there's no formal scope for judicial interpretation in continental civil law systems. On those systems, the legislature is supreme. Judges are merely expected to mechanically implement the law, which should be complete, coherent, and clear. And since it's not realistically possible for legislatures to anticipate all cases that could come before the courts, judicial consistency and predictability come not from judicial interpretation, but from the further elaboration of often very extensive codes of legal rules and guidance that give expression to the meaning of statutes. Now, this rules-based approach has the benefit of offering legal consistency, with less need for expert inspectorates, and I think that's kind of quite important. But it cannot flexibly match regulatory interventions to the potential harms posed on a case-by-case basis. So as a kind of consequence, one consequence of this is that health and safety regulation in France and Germany is set out in enormous tomes of rules, be it Code Travail or the German Berufsgenossenschaften kind of rules, like that. And in fact, one paradoxical consequence of this is that actually statutes, general statutes which demand safety, in fact, are implemented according to kind of a whole set of subsidiary rules which may not necessarily equate to safety themselves. Now, while this approach may avoid the kind of the problem with Britain we have with health and safety madness, its problem is that the rules are often hard to follow, incomplete, and sometimes even conflict. There's a report which I love by the French inspector, labour inspector at the Direct, rather dryly puts the problems of inevitably sort of selective enforcement of detailed rules. The law in practice is, by nature, not fully overlapping with the law. Here's the third set of constraints, which I think concerns ideas of risk, security, and danger, and their particularity to state context. The relationship, I think, between risk and regulation has strong roots in a centuries-old common law tradition regarding nuisances, that regulatory intervention should be calibrated to match the harms posed. Now, this is most obvious in the US, where the judiciary exercises a strong check on state action, only permitting regulatory interventions where harms can be posed. And there's a lot of important case law in the US. And I think this has corollaries in the UK, where the state tends to respond to harms as and when they arise, largely through piecemeal policy solutions. This is a nice quote of Sidney Webb's back in 1910 of the piecemeal adoption of factory legislation. It was a typical example of English practical empiricism that began with no abstract theory of social justice or the rights of man. We've always been incapable of taking a general view of the subject we were legislating upon. Each successive statute was aimed at remedying a single ascertained evil. It was in vain that objectors urged that other evils, no more defensible, existed in other trades. Neither logic nor consistency was permitted to stand in the way of a practical remedy for a proved wrong. I think probably something which still stands the test of time. But in France, ideas of risk fit less well with the implicit promise by the French state to provide security. Such concerns appear to have been behind a surprising claim in 1986 that a radioactive cloud spewing from the Chernobyl reactor stopped at the French borders. It was also implicit in the tendency to prosecute public officials in the aftermath of failures, such as when the former Minister of Health was found guilty of manslaughter over the contaminated blood scandal that the ex-Prime Minister Fabius set all free. Indeed, rather than being invoked as a means of defining the limits of state action, the French state tends to invoke risk as an excuse for state intervention, in ways that perhaps reinforce the idea of the protective state. There's a term, sécurité sanitaire, that's become very popular, I think, for French governments in recent years, that is, by definition, antithetical to the idea of managed risk, which is all about differential interventions. No, it's security everywhere. In Germany, by contrast, I think risk ideas are constrained by legalistic policy cultures. The problem, I think, is quite historical. 19th century liberal conceptions of the Prussian state regarded the protection of people from dangers to life, freedom, and property as one of the few legitimate grounds for state interference in people's lives, maybe not unlike the US. But dangers in Germany were broadly dealt with in binary terms. If there was no danger, there was no grounds for state action. With the evolution of the Rechtsstaat after the Second World War, this constitutional principle of Schutzpflicht, which defines the threshold of danger that has to be reached before the state has a right to interfere with individuals' private rights, has become increasingly important. So while the courts recognise that some small residual risk can be tolerated, they've struggled to reconcile binary ideas of danger, no danger, with the idea of acceptable risk. And attempts to do so have resulted in intractable legal conflicts between stakeholders seeking to protect their conflicting, the constitutionally enshrined rights to economic activity and health protection. And this happened throughout the 70s and 80s when the anti-nuclear movement mounted a legal challenge over the risk from nuclear power stations. And the courts just simply couldn't agree on what an acceptable level of risk was. So, what conclusions can I draw? Well, I think these national patterns of how risk is conceived in different national contexts tells us something quite important about what the state is for. In the UK, I think you've got a risk state, insofar as the adoption of risk ideas is a kind of an attempt to rationalise the limits of state action in the absence of constitutional limits of what the state can do. In France, I think by contrast, risk is not invoked as a rationalising concept, defined in terms of probability and impact, because such a rationalisation would create problems for the constitutional principle of equality. Rather, risk is simply a peril that justifies state intervention and reinforces an idea of a strong state. Whereas I think in Germany, risk is a problem for the Rechtsstaat because of the binary concept of Schutzpflicht, which only permits state action to manage clear and present dangers, and doesn't provide an easy way for dealing with those risks that present neither an immediate danger nor are insignificant. Indeed, I think that's probably the real origin of the precautionary principle. It's less to do with how to deal with scientific uncertainty, it's actually how to deal with legal uncertainty when faced with harms which didn't quite fit into this danger idea. So I think it suggests that far from being a principle that should have universal appeal across country contexts, risk ideas are laden with assumptions that may have an ill fit with legal traditions and political philosophies and economies of continental Europe.
That was fascinating, we'll go straight on, if I may, and invite Professor Furley. Stuart Furley, also from King's College London, from the Department of Management, to talk about governance and regulatory roles.
And this is a joint paper with Jean-Louis Denis and Joanne Préval from the National School of Public Administration in Montreal, Quebec. So it's a research agenda paper, and we're trying to explore the nature of regulatory and risk management systems in healthcare. We come from a health public management perspective, that's our academic background. So briefly, I know we're a bit short of time, so I'm going to try and speak briefly. We want to bring in 3 theoretical streams that we think might help us look at the nature of risk management systems in healthcare, and then do an initial scan of the healthcare system and particularly regulatory bodies in England and Canada using information essentially available on websites, and there's actually quite a lot. Just by way of background, and this reinforces the previous paper, I think, that you can't divorce what we're talking about from the political economy of what we call new public management reforms, which were brought in this country in the 80s and have stuck. And I just listed them there, I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I see new regulatory bodies as part and parcel of this wider bundle of new public management reforms. So if we look at what happened to the privatised industries such as water, privatised but regulated. More ambiguous in the public sector, quasi-privatised, quasi-markets, quasi-regulation. And from these new regulatory bodies come a number of new risk management practices which are of particular interest. But I don't think that, I think we have a very peculiar system of what we might call centralisation. So at one level we have NHS Foundation trusts, which are proclaimed to have operational freedoms, but they still face intense indirect steering from the centre. So having under new public management reforms, having decentralised operational control down to autonomised delivery units such as NHSFTs, the question arises, how does the centre seek to risk manage such a vast operational field in healthcare? And how should the new risk management regimes which have been developed be understood? So I'm just going to introduce 3 theoretical prisms which might help us do this. And the first is what we call governmentality. And essentially, this comes from the work of Michel Foucault, who was a French social theorist, picked up by theorists at the LSE, in particular Miller, actually at King's, Rose, actually at King's, Miller and Rose. And they looked at how the advancement neoliberal state, of which they take the UK as a prime example, indirectly steers the field. And they come up with a number of concepts. I'm just going to say them very briefly here. There's an interesting notion of an electronic panopticon, surveillance through ICTs. A very good example of this, a new PhD student who's working on infection control. There were weekly infection control reports up to the Department of Health. You put them in on the Friday. If you had an outbreak, you could have inspectors in your hospital on the Monday. So at one level, you were an NHSFT, decentralised. At another level, under intense electronic scrutiny. The notion of grey sciences, clinical audit, patient safety system, at one level mundane, at another level pervasive. And the way in which particular bodies of expertise come together, for example, in evidence-based medicine guidelines. To me, there's quite a powerful theoretical stream around governmentality, which can be applied to the construction of risk management regimes. And actually look at the nature of the risk management systems themselves. How are they made up? What are the formal algorithms? What are the classification systems? Who decides? Who constructs these systems? So if you looked at, for example, the example of patient safety systems in the NHS, Justin Waring's good work, about how information is reported, how that information changes as it moves around the system. How do these explicit risk management systems coexist with traditional methods of professional self-regulation? Are they contested? Is there in fact contradiction between the 2 modes of risk management? How does knowledge and information change as it moves around the healthcare system? Do risk management systems remain proportionate, or do they ever expand? The work of Mike Power, for example, on the Risk Society suggests all public agencies are expansionist, they don't face market or customer tests, they will expand their jurisdiction forever, even if pointlessly left to themselves. So we get this perspective would predict the rise and rise of risk management practices. And thirdly, there's a developing set of literature on standards and standardisation. So what's the difference between standards as opposed to rules? The notion of standards is more voluntaristic. The standard setting seems to be well developed in healthcare settings, perhaps to reduce variation and risk. But again, this is a move away from tacit self-regulation. So what are the behaviours that we see around standards? And again, who develops standards and how? Okay, so have I got, say, 7 more minutes?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm just going to whiz through some very quick empirical examples now. So we think those are 3 interesting theoretical literatures that could be brought in. So my Canadian colleagues and myself wrote a very quick paper looking at scanning across what we've got in the 2 countries. So clearly, in the UK, we actually have 2 or 3 regulators. We have Monitor, which is an economic and financial regulator for FTs. It has a risk assessment framework. It'd be interesting to know more about that. It concentrates on issues of financial sustainability and poor governance. So it has its two dimensions where it's particularly interested. Alongside Monitor, we have the Care Quality Commission. We heard something about that today. It has a controversial history. It's trying to move towards a new system based on outcomes rather than processes and develop a new inspection model. Kieran talked a lot about that. But it also has a public rating system with a traffic light system. So literally providers are flagged as green, amber or red. So it'd be interesting to know more about how that system has been constructed. And the third system, which is in operation, is the National Reporting and Learning System, which has reports of patient safety-related incidents which are reported to the centre. It now says it has data on 4 million incidents, the largest database in the world, which again is reported electronically. And now they've set up a patient safety laboratory. So those are 3 kind of regulators in the UK. Example, just move across quickly to Canada, where there's a distinction between federal and provincial agencies. At federal level, there's the Canadian Institute for Health Information, an independent not-for-profit agency, collects data on cost, quality and access to care. It runs the National System for Incident Reporting, rather similar name to the UK system. And it develops safety indicators, performance metrics, which they say will support learning and improvement. The view from Canada is that it has a very developmental style and no coercive power. So there does appear to be a difference between regimes in Canada and regimes as they developed within the UK. Second one, Canadian Patient Safety Institute, development of training tools, web platforms, capacity building, again an emphasis on a formative and developmental approach with a broad set of collaborations and partners. And finally, Accreditation Canada, set up back in the 1950s as a not-for-profit national organisation, now developing some international presence, and developing a comprehensive list of standards for the healthcare field, and some provincial level activity also in Canada, notably in Ontario. So, to conclude, I think that the 3 theoretical prisms provide a useful theoretical entree into the field. I think it's interesting to follow up from the last session to explore international variations in regulatory and risk management practices. In this case, a comparison between UK and Canada, and to explain why. There does appear to be a growth of risk management-oriented agencies and practices in both healthcare systems, although taking a different tone in different countries. I think the notion of grey sciences, from a mentality perspective, appears very promising to explore this field. And I'm also interested, actually, we haven't talked about this so far, who becomes an inspector and why? The creation of expert roles and identities. What happens if you cease to be a professional and you become an inspector? What happens to you? What happens to your identity or whatever? I haven't talked about that so far. Okay, so I'll probably stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and two presentations that really complemented each other. I'm going to move on to our final speaker this morning, Dr. Jean Moore. Jean wowed us at this conference last year. Well, she wowed me at this conference last year. I was telling her it's one of her slides from last year that I've been using ever since. Jean is from the New York Center for Health Workforce Studies at the University of New York.
Thank you. So I can never decide which is worse, being the last speaker before lunch or the first speaker after lunch. But take heart, I'm from New York, I can talk very quickly, and I will run through my slides in record time, so it will not detain you much. So I'm going to be talking about something a little different. It really isn't about risk management, but it's really about what's happening in the U.S. and what's happening in relation to emerging health professions, actually in the arena of oral health. So I want to give you a little background, and for those of you who heard me talk last year, apologies that there's some repetition, but I think it's so important to understand context. So health reform is transforming the healthcare landscape in the U.S. Of course, that presumes we survive the next Supreme Court challenge, but nonetheless, the goals are to increase access to basic health insurance or health services through health insurance, provide high-quality, cost-effective care, and ultimately to improve population health. And what's happening with health reform is pretty interesting because we're shifting the focus of care to primary and preventive care. Attempts to integrate primary care, behavioral health, and oral health services, better coordination of care, and payment reform, moving away from fee-for-service and toward managed care arrangements, incentives for keeping people healthy, penalties for poor outcomes. What's also happening is that we're seeing new models of care emerge, and there's tremendous focus on team-based approaches to care. And the team composition and roles are going to vary depending on the patient population being served, but teams include a lot of different players, highly trained to more entry-level workers, but collectively working to provide care. And another interesting aspect is that primary care provider roles are expanding with the expectation that they're looking more closely at behavioral health, oral health, conducting assessments. So there are some workforce issues associated with this. We talk a lot about health practitioner shortages, but honestly, I think really what we need to do is figure out how to make better use of who we have now. They're not where they need to be, they're not serving who needs the service, and I think that really tends to complicate things. It's not clear we're training the health workforce for the future. We're not exposing health profession students to team-based models of care, into professional education. We talk about team-based care. Do we teach people how to work together on teams? Not very well. Nor are we training in emerging functions, things like care coordination, what population health means and how it should impact the practice. Another important aspect is that legal scope of practice is not well aligned with professional competence. I'm going to say a little more about that. And so what happens is that the shared responsibility that we need for effective team-based care can be very challenging. So there's an increased interest in scope of practice regulation, concern that these regulations impact cost, quality, and access. I'm going to give you an example of this. So in the US, basic restorative oral health services are primarily provided by dentists, and the dentists are primarily found in private practices. That works for about 75% of the population, but the other 25% of the population aren't showing up in these dental practices for care. They can't afford it, it's not accessible to them, so they wind up oftentimes showing up in an emergency room in a dental crisis. And so costs skyrocket. The cost of dealing with a dental crisis that could have been prevented is very challenging and disconcerting, and the quality isn't very good. Usually it's palliative, not restorative. So again, I think that these issues are on the minds of states. And in the US, states are primarily responsible for regulating health professions, including training and education, scope of practice, some of the key issues that affect who can do what to whom. So some of the issues with state-based health professions regulation is that there's a mismatch between what people are trained and capable of doing versus what we actually allow them to do. So there's lack of uniformity in legal scopes of practice across states. Sometimes, particularly for emerging professions, there's inconsistency in training and education requirements. And the final aspect is that the process for changing the rules at state levels tends to be very slow and adversarial. And in the arena of oral health, it's the dentist versus anyone who they think is encroaching on their territory. So states have actually been able to make some progress in supporting workforce innovation. And I want to talk with you a little bit, give you some examples of some of the things that states are doing and some of the things they've accomplished. So one approach is to expand stakeholder input into scope of practice decision making. Typically when a new rule is proposed, again, it's one profession pitted against another profession. And efforts to kind of broaden the dialogue and perhaps start with a question, what do patients need? Rather than what's in the best interest of a particular profession. Using the best available data and evidence to support scope of practice decision making. Sadly, that doesn't happen as often as it ought to. And in the absence of evidence, allowing demonstration projects that are carefully evaluated to figure out if they work. Another state strategy has been to target workforce innovations specifically to underserved populations. So I'm going to give you some examples, and you know, for the sake of full disclosure, I chose oral health because my center recently got a federal contract, a 5-year contract to do oral health workforce research. So a lot of our focus these days is on oral health access and issues around oral health innovation. So I feel well versed in this. But anyway, some examples of what states are doing to try to move this forward. In Virginia, one of the things they've done is established an advisory board. And that advisory board is comprised of representatives from 13 health professional licensing boards and 5 citizen members, which means they're open to input from others beyond the professional realm. And they look at scope of practice conflicts, they evaluate health professions to consider need for regulation, degree of regulation, and among the criteria they use when they consider these things is risk for harm to consumers, specialized skills, autonomous practice, economic impact. And at the same time, they've recently established a healthcare workforce data center. So not only do they have a broader dialogue, but they also have data to inform the discussion. And this group is currently assisting with a series of reviews into the potential barriers to effective team-based models posed by scope of practice restrictions. And dental hygiene is among the first profession to be assessed. And I was actually got a sneak peek at the draft report they're preparing, and they talk about policy options that include broadening their scope of practice, expanding the settings, giving them more autonomy. So I think that, again, it will be informed by data and evidence, less by anecdote. This is an interesting one. So in 2011, Maine mandated a study of oral health care needs in their state. And my center was actually involved in conducting the study, so I can give you a little more depth about what happened. So one of the things we did was they wanted an assessment of oral health delivery in Maine. We managed to get our hands on, so there is something called all-payer claims databases, so that when services are provided in a state, all the claims go to one place. And we managed to get information about Medicaid patients, so these state-insured lower-income groups compared to commercially insured people who had dental insurance. And we looked at commuting patterns, and we said, okay, how far does somebody with commercial insurance have to travel to get oral health services, and how does that compare to a MaineCare patient? And we found some dramatic differences. And interestingly, the State Dental Society said, well, there's a dentist within 30 miles of every town in Maine. And what that report told me was that those dentists are inaccessible to certain populations. Another thing we looked at was the oral health workforce in Maine. We actually were able to conduct surveys of the various providers. And what we found was that there was actually an oversupply of dental hygienists. There were more dental hygienists in Maine than there were jobs in Maine. And so we began to think, okay, so there's oral health access issues, and we appear to have an oversupply of a very well-trained oral health professionals. So another report that we produced was showing some options for ways in which you might better use the existing workforce or think about some new ways to use them to address need. And in 2014, Maine passed a law recognizing dental hygiene therapists. So these therapists get some additional training, additional hours of clinical practice, work either directly under a licensed dentist or under a written practice agreement. They've expanded the settings they can work in, and at least half the patients they serve are the target population of underserved. I think right now they're in the process of establishing the education program and trying to decide the best where best to house it and move forward. Another interesting one that I'm sure you've probably heard of is the Alaska Dental Health Aid Therapist. And this was really initiated by the tribal councils of Alaska, who said, our members cannot get access to dental services, we've got to think out of the box. And they actually adopted the dental therapist model in place in New Zealand, and were able to move forward with it. And the first class actually went to New Zealand for training, because no programs existed in the US for this model. That's since changed. But 20 months of training, 400 hours of clinical, supervised clinical training. Most importantly, the members were recruited from local tribal communities. They were trained and returned to those communities. And they provide a wide range of oral health services. And they work under the general supervision of a dentist, but it tends to be remote because they are in very remote places. So oftentimes I believe they use telehealth approaches. So there have been a number of evaluations of this model, and the conclusions drawn from these evaluations are that the DHATs provide safe, competent, and appropriate care comparable to what a dentist provides. The tribal communities are reporting increased access, reduced wait times, reduced travel times, patients are satisfied. Again, they're from the community, and that is probably a large part of why they've been as successful as they have. Minnesota was another state that followed suit and added dental therapists and advanced dental therapists. So the dental therapist is a 40-month bachelor's program. The ADT is a master's degree, and it presumes that the person is a dental hygienist coming in. So ADTs actually have a somewhat broader scope of practice. They can provide preventive services as well as the basic restorative services. They both work under the supervision of a dentist, and half the caseload must be underserved populations. There was an initial evaluation of the program, and essentially what they found was that the belief was that the DTs, the ADTs, were actually doing what the state had hoped. Serving more patients, reducing wait times, reducing ER use, which is pretty important, again, for states looking at that bottom line. And clinics report personnel savings, increased productivity, improved patient satisfaction. And the last example is California. So California has something called the Health Workforce Pilot Projects Program. And one of their pilot projects was a virtual dental home. Virtual dental home meant taking dental hygienists and dental assistants and allowing them to practice in a community-based oral health care delivery system. Settings like preschools, elementary schools, nursing homes. Again, targeting underserved populations. An evaluation of the program found some positive results, and as a result, there was a law enacted that actually recognized the program and provided reimbursement for the services of the virtual dental home. So the good news is that, states and local communities are designed to come up with local solutions to problems. The bad news is that it continues to contribute to state variation. So my question is, if you're a dental therapist in Alaska and you wanted to move to Minnesota, given how very different the training is and the other thing, would you be allowed to? And so I think that we face that issue of creating something that really requires a bit more convergence in these emerging models across states over time. And one thing I want to say is, as I was coming here, a colleague of mine sent me a report on some research about dental therapists in the UK and about their effectiveness. And it was surprising for me to learn that dental therapists are actually practicing in the UK, and I think what wonderful opportunities for us to learn from each other about these approaches and ways in which we can expand access to oral health services mindfully. Thank you.